2011, after the killing of Osama bin Laden, Americans stormed the White House with American flags, chanted USA. Of course, nothing like that last night. Certainly no one would expect that to happen, considering that very few people knew who Soleimani was in the United States before last night. But at the same time, is it not fair to say that the killing of Soleimani will have a far greater impact on the shaping of events moving forward in the world, Middle East and the world, than even the killing of Osama bin Laden?
I think it's fair to say it's the most seismic event in the Middle East in the 21st century. Dexter Filkins is quite right. Qasem Soleimani was perhaps the most Machiavellian military commander we've seen in not just one generation, but several generations, single-handedly responsible for overseeing and orchestrating Iran's proxy wars in, I lost count in the number of countries, at least half a dozen. Boasted in 2007, I believe, to David Petraeus, his counterpart in Iraq on the other side. I hope you enjoy the brief respite that you're getting here in Baghdad. I've been busy in Beirut. That was during the Israel-Lebanon war. He is singular, and in fact, I would argue he's irreplaceable, although his replacement has just been announced by the Quds Force. An Iran-Iraq war veteran, very charismatic. In recent days, particularly during the U.S.-led campaign against ISIS, Soleimani has risen in this sort of cult of personality style of a figure, which has led to all kinds of speculation that he was plotting a political career in Iran, perhaps as president, perhaps as something even bigger. He was doing a lot of selfies on the battlefield, essentially taunting the United States. It's important to remember, Joe, when the U.S. waged its occupation of Iraq, we forget this. We think that we fought a campaign against Sunni jihadists and insurgents, the tip of the spear, of course, being al-Qaeda in Iraq, the organization which then became ISIS. But Joint Special Operations Command actually had two task forces in place under General McChrystal and McRaven. One was called Task Force 16, which went after al-Qaeda in Iraq. The other was called Task Force 17, which was dedicated to, quote, countering Iranian influence. By that, they meant countering Qasem Soleimani. By the U.S. government's own estimate, Iran, again, with Soleimani orchestrating all of this, was responsible for 603 U.S. soldier fatalities in Iraq. At one point, I believe it was June of 2007, Shia militias under Soleimani's command, or at least overseen by him, were responsible for 2/3 of the U.S. fatalities in Iraq. So if you look at the history of the U.S. occupation of Iraq, that, I think, is going to give you a foretaste of what is to come. This is the kind of thing Iran, and again, Soleimani especially, were past masters at, waging plausibly deniable attacks against American targets, drawing loads of American blood on their hands, and then sort of saying, well, it wasn't us, it was somebody else. That's the kind of thing I would anticipate going forward. But again, this is such a sort of unprecedented event, I can't emphasize that enough, that it's almost impossible to say what the next steps are going to be. Is it conventional war, or is it, as I mentioned, proxy war and, you know, cyber warfare by Iran, more attacks, tanker warfare in the Gulf, and so on and so forth. But I actually think that the supreme leader of Iran himself doesn't know what to do at this moment. Remember, on January 1st, 2 days ago, Khamenei was taunting Donald Trump on Twitter, saying the U.S. can do nothing. You're basically calling the president a paper tiger. And if you know anything about Donald Trump, this is a man who doesn't like to be taunted, who doesn't like to be sort of bullied back by somebody else. I would actually wager that one of the precipitating factors for this operation was indeed the supreme leader of Iran basically saying, bring it on.
Michael, all great points. Admiral, I suspect perhaps that taunting, the president being taunted by the leader of North Korea, all may have led to this. I'm just curious, though, whether the well, first of all, would you agree with Michael that this is one of the most significant actions in the Middle East in the 21st century? Would you say this is, as I was trying to explain to some friends last night that hadn't followed Iran as closely, I had suggested that this was the most significant foreign policy decision we had made in 17 years since we decided to invade Iraq. Would that be your assessment?
Indeed, it would, Joe. And As you were saying, in the 21st century, my mind went immediately to the decision to invade Iraq. And you can drop a plumb line from that decision to where we are today. This is an inflection point. And so what's happening in the Pentagon, two things. One are all the defensive things we talked about a moment ago to prepare for all the wide potential range of counter strikes that Iran can do. And by the way, I really do want to draw a line under cyber. We have an enormous cyber vulnerability here. I think that's going to be the first tool in the toolkit. There'll be more behind that. But the Pentagon's working on those defensive measures. But, Joe, here's the other thing. The Pentagon, because it's what we do, is developing the offensive options right now for the president. Because if Iran does lash out in a very significant way, we are going to be prepared at least to go back. And that is going to take us off to the races. And that'll be everything from aircraft carriers flowing to the region, Marine expeditionary units, our ground-based air there. That whole package is going to be prepped and ready. And we need to think through the strategy. And again, that's what's missing. And I'll close by saying a strategy for this ought to include our allies, partners, and friends. We've been talking for 20 minutes and really haven't mentioned the role of the Europeans, the role of the Israelis, the role of the Arabs. We need to strategically think about how to integrate our allies into what happens next. We need an interagency coordination here. We're going to have to deal with this with all the elements of national power, not just the Pentagon. And thirdly and finally, private sector vulnerabilities here. Again, I'll close with cyber. We ought to really be focusing on that as we think about it. We've got to also control the strategic narrative here. A few tweets is not going to get this done. The president has some big decisions today. Who's he going to call? What's he going to say publicly that is going to steer this? Hopefully there is some strategic thinking alongside that offensive military package that I assure you is being developed right now.
All right, Admiral James Stavridis, thank you so much for being with us. Hans Nichols, really quickly, what are you expecting today? Any word from White House officials?
I think the first thing we need to see if this trip, speaking to the evangelicals tonight, is still on, whether or not the president will decide to summon the pool. He's not scheduled to leave until later on. But will we see the president on camera this morning? And what readouts, to Admiral Stavridis' point, what readouts will there be with foreign leaders? And crucially, will he call House Speaker Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer and inform Congress of what, as everyone seems to be agreed upon, is a momentous foreign policy decision? Joe?
It most certainly is. Thank you so much, Hans Nichols in Mar-a-Lago. Greatly appreciated. And still ahead on Morning Joe, President Trump has the United States on the brink of war when just a few years ago he was mixing up the Cuds and the Kurds and didn't even know who General Soleimani was. We'll rewind the tape ahead and try to figure out what's next. You're watching Morning Joe. We'll be right back. Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.